Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. We will be starting chapter 18 today, so look for some chapter 18 questions. This chapter is like a precursor to World War I, and if you look in the textbook, you'll notice that the dates for this chapter are 1890 to 1914, which is the start date for World War I in Europe. So today we're looking specifically at progress, upheaval, and movement. All right, so this chapter looks at the anxieties and the insecurities of the unsettled world of the 20th century. And so there are some key factors that we will be looking at that kind of sum up what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. And so these three factors are, number one, is there is the large-scale migration of people from rural to urban areas. So rural is countryside, urban is city. So as the Industrial Revolution takes place and industrialism grows, leading to urbanization, which is the building of cities, people leave the countryside and move into cities to find factory jobs. Another factor that contributed to this unsettled world is simply poverty. With increased industrialization, there was a wealth gap between rich and poor, which caused some people to believe in radical ideas like Marxist communism. So poverty caused an unsettled world as well. And then another thing that led to this unsettled world was simply resistance to imperialism. This is the age of imperialism. Many European countries, the United States, had colonies elsewhere throughout the world. And as a result, the people living in those colonies resisted that imperialism. They didn't like being controlled by a more powerful nation. And so there were rebellions against imperial powers. All right, so looking at some of the effects of new industries, like I just said, with this growing capitalism, there were businesses that did really well. There was economic growth for nations. That economic growth really didn't translate so much to the workers. The average factory worker was not seeing the benefits of this massive economic growth, but nations were. And this economic growth resulted in inequality. That is an income gap. So the wealthy got wealthier, the poor got poorer. As a result of industries, cities grew. Like we said, people flocked from rural areas to urban areas. And many times cities grew faster than what they could keep up with. One good thing about the growth of cities is that many of them gained new cultural institutions. So in order to accommodate these growing populations, cities would build museums or libraries. And, you know, the average factory worker couldn't really afford to go to museums, and they probably didn't have time to spend the day at a library, but there were some residents who had the leisure time and the disposable income to enjoy these cultural institutions. Another effect of the growth of cities is that, like I said, they grew faster than what the city could keep up with. So cities housed millions of people in crowded, unsanitary, disease-ridden slums. And so that's kind of a negative side effect. Also, cities were like the hotbed of crime. So because people were poor, because they were looking for jobs, because they were disease-ridden, this just kind of lent itself to a life of crime for some people. All right, so another effect of these new industries was radical ideas. So some people, some intellectuals, some writers focused on the downside of progress. So people like Karl Marx and Frederick Engels and Charles Fourier, who wanted a utopian socialist society. But there was a whole generation of writers and artists and scientists who kind of broke away from traditional ideas and wound up becoming labeled as modernists. And these ideas, even though not everyone accepted Marx or Engels' ideas or Fourier's ideas, These ideas did circulate the globe and became, in some places, very popular. All right, so mass immigration. Immigration with an E means people were leaving their country. Immigration with an I means people are going to a new country. So an immigrant is both. They are both a person who leaves their country and one who goes to a new country. So immigration with an E just means people were leaving their country in mass, which led to all sorts of social problems and labor problems, not to mention most of the people who were immigrating were male, so it led to gender imbalances. There were several reasons why people immigrated. Some people left to work in mines. A lot of times, imperial nations would send people from their own populations to the colonies. So they sent colonial officials and they sent soldiers from the homeland to the new colony. So that's one reason why people were immigrating. People were missionaries, some were merchants, some were traders, but there were lots of reasons to be an immigrant. City planning. So it wasn't long before cities figured out that if they did not come up with a plan for what their city would look like, where people would live, where people would work, how to deal with pollution and waste and the sewage problems and things like that, if they didn't do that, then the city would become disgusting. And so some cities even hired people to be like city planners, and they would plan what would go where. So in other words, this is a residential district. This is, where the factories can be. So city planning was a really good thing because it eliminated some of the problems of congestion and crime and unsanitary conditions. New industries also led to changes for women. One thing is that more jobs were available for women in factories. There was also an increased level of literacy during this time, which led to cheaper reading materials, and you have more women reading, more women, going to these libraries that cities built. Another interesting thing is that with people moving into cities is that there were more ready-made clothes and goods available. So women did not have to work in the factory and also sew their clothing for all of their family members. So because of the availability of manufactured goods, because of globalization, that did allow women to relax a little more. At least they didn't have to, work in a factory 12 hours a day and then come home and knit their clothing or sew their clothing together because they were able to buy these things already made. All right, so like we said, another reason why this is an unsettled age is because colonists did not like being colonists, and so they resisted their European imperial powers. Looking at Africa, there was lots of unrest in Africa. The interesting thing is that Europeans viewed this as like a civilizing mission, so they thought that they were doing everyone a favor in taking them over, and the reason why they thought that is because they were laying railroad track, they were putting in telegraph lines, and they did, in some cases offer schools and hospitals and things like that. The problem is that the colonists could have left all that to the side. They just wanted freedom. They wanted to be able to rule themselves. And so typically the Europeans would violently suppress any resistance in their colonies. And as time went on, they used more force, more bloodshed. And so the 20th century in Africa was kind of violent. One of the wars that took place in Africa is called the Boer Wars. And this is actually between mainly two groups of Europeans. So initially the Dutch, the Afrikaners, had settled in South Africa. And then the British decided that they wanted that territory. There was gold to be had there. And so they came and took it over from the Afrikaners. Well, then war broke out in 1899 and 1902, and this is probably the most devastating colonial war in Africa during this time. In terms of bloodshed, in terms of money spent and lives lost, this was probably the worst. And so this war revolved around gold resources that were found in South Africa. The British won this war, but not without enormous expenditure. So in terms of men, material, prestige, money, they even though they won this war, there was loss on the British end too. For one, the British would confine civilians to concentration camps, and then stories of that were spread all over the world. And so this is 1900. That we were expecting more out of the British than this by 1900, and so their reputation was tarnished on the world stage as a result of their actions toward the Afrikaners during the Boer War. The Germans did a similar thing. There was two groups of people, the Herero and the San people in Southwest Africa, and the Germans practically committed genocide against those groups of people. And this too aroused public revulsion in the Western world. This stuff was publicized. There were pictures in newspapers and stories. And so the Germans looked really bad as a result of that. They treated people the same way in East Africa, in a German East Africa colony as well, around the same time in the Maji Maji revolt. Or it's Maji, I'm not sure. It's M-A-J-I. Not sure how that's pronounced. But Westerners tried to rationalize these incidents, saying that these Africans are fanatics, they're crazy. And then they accused other Europeans of stirring up strife, like, oh, the British came in and they caused these people to rise up against us, and they tried all sorts of ways to justify this behavior, but ultimately it was, despicable how they treated their colonists. All right, so the Boxer Rebellion in China. I feel like we've talked about this before in this class, but it may just be overlapping with what we've talked about in world history, so I don't know. But anyway, hopefully you have heard of this before, and this will just be review. But the Boxer Uprising in China had a couple of underlying causes. One is that there was a breakdown of authority, and the Empress Dowager had thrown the emperor put him in house arrest and was now ruling, and so there was instability politically, but also there was overpopulation which strained resources. Not to mention the Chinese had been defeated in the Sino-Japanese War. And so this was a humiliating defeat for the Chinese against the Japanese, because typically Japan had been the student in the teacher-student relationship between China and Japan. Japan had been the student. And after Japan was forced to modernize by the United States, they rapidly modernized and defeated China in this war. So this was really humiliating. After that, the Japanese came in and other Western powers, and they pushed for spheres of influence in China. And so China was kind of forced to do whatever everyone wanted economically. The United States proposed the open door policy, which would allow all these Western powers and Japan equal access to China. And so this wasn't a political takeover, but they were controlling things economically. And so the Boxer Rebellion is an uprising that was started as a result of the Chinese being forced to modernize. They didn't want to modernize. They wanted to remain a traditional Chinese society. So the Boxers were mostly peasants. There were some landholders as well, and they blamed Western Christian missionaries and their Chinese converts, so Chinese Christians, and Western powers for their country's condition. Interestingly, the Boxers believed that they had superpowers, and that if they practiced calisthenics, this is why they're called the Boxers, like their aerobic exercises looked like boxing. And so they believed that if they practiced this type of exercise, then they would be protected, they would be like invincible to European weapons. And so that obviously was not the case. A bullet will still go through your body if you practice boxing. And I guess, they found that out. So this movement was controversial. It flourished most in northern China. And the reason why is because that area was hard hit by natural disasters and harsh economic conditions. At any rate, the Qing kind of go back and forth in whether they want to support the Boxers or not. And the Empress Dowager, who had thrown the emperor into house arrest, decided to embrace them in 1900. And so, you have Boxers, and with support by the Qing, who are harassing and killing Christians. They were destroying railroad track, they were destroying telegraph lines, and in Beijing, they would besiege foreign embassies. And so this thing grew to be a considerable rebellion. And so there was actually a multinational foreign army who had to go into China to crush this rebellion. In doing so, they undermined the Qing dynasty's ability to rule China and made them look inferior or incapable. It's kind of like if a teacher can't control her classroom and the principal has to come in and like correct the students. It undermines the teacher's authority. And so this is kind of what happened with the Qing dynasty, the fact that a foreign army had to come in and restore order. All right, so quickly we'll finish up here quickly because I realize time is getting away from me as I continue to talk. Other insecurities during this time. One is that the balance of power in Europe was shifting. After the German unification movement and the Italian unification movement, you have two new, very strong powers in Europe. Not to mention there were new alliances that appeared that put France and Britain and Russia against the Germans. Not to mention the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg or the Austrian Empire were weakening during this time. Large firms dominated the global economy. Because of laissez-faire capitalism, that kind of gave way to this economic order that was dominated by large businesses. And so as a result of that, instead of having, smooth, even progress, the economy of the West kind of bounced between booms and busts depending on these large firms that dominated the economy. Reformers called for government regulation of business. Some people feared that businesses were so large and powerful and had the ability to control the global economy, and so some reformers wanted government regulation of business. National economies impacted global economies. So if there was a crisis in the United States, like there was one in 1907, we had a small financial crisis. And because our economies were entangled, it actually caused a crisis in Canada and Mexico and Egypt because of our trade relationship with those countries. And so a problem in one nation can lead to a problem in other nations by 1900. Industrialism spread, as we already said. Trains and ships, steamships, connected communities. So far-reaching places remained or became more accessible because of technologies. Unfortunately, this often destroyed local customs. That's kind of the cost of globalization, is that local economies are threatened. All right, that's it. Send me a picture of your notes. Y'all have a great day.